Let's start. Dr. Bhujbal also message. We can start.
Good afternoon, all. I, Dr. Sriram Doshi, Secretary GPA Pune, welcomes you all for today's lecture. It is given by well-known physician Dr. Parikshit Prayag. He will speak on differential and approach to the fever. This subject is very useful to the family physician. Now I request GPA President Dr. Rupa Agarwal to say a few words.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, friends. Friday Study Circle has always been a great learning opportunity for all of us. And when it comes to infectious diseases, it has taken a new turn since when we have come across few viral infections. So into it, now in last 6 to 8 months, because of COVID, we have jumped into a totally new domain in learning how to handle various COVID related fevers, and let us not forget the other reasons for fever for which we have our expert Dr. Parikshit Prayag sir with us. To introduce Dr. Parikshit Prayag, we also have our own Dr. B.V. Kulkarni, सगळ्यांचे खूप चहेते लाडके GPA member आहेत B.V. Kulkarni sir. So I request Dr. Sriram Doshi sir, Secretary, to introduce Dr. B.V. Kulkarni sir and to start with the session.
Thank you, ma'am. Dr. B.V. Kulkarni, alias Balkrishna Kulkarni, passed out his BMS in 1982 from Pune University. First, he was practicing in Islampur in a small GP indoor. Shifted to Pune in 1995. Now practicing in the Baudhan in the morning and evening as Ayurvedic consultant for sexology and renal stone. Sexology is his special subject. His hobbies are photography, dancing, writing, playing with mouth organ, trekking, acting, traveling. Now I request Dr. B.V. Kulkarni to take a charge.
Hello. Thanks, Sriram. Hello, dignitaries, guest speaker, and friends. Good afternoon, all. Dr. Shirish Prayag, Dr. Parikshit Prayag, extremely sorry, MD, ABIM, ABMS, American Board Certified in Internal Medicine, Rutgers University, New Jersey, American Board Certified in Infectious Diseases, MD Anderson Cancer Center, Houston, American Transplantation Society Certified in Transplant Infectious Diseases, Stanford University, California, Section Editor, Infectious Diseases, Indian Journal of Medical and Pediatric Oncology, Reviver, Indian Journal of Critical Care Medicine, and now consultant as Transplant Infectious Diseases, Dinath Mangeshkar Hospital, Pune. Friends, we are very lucky to have a speaker like this, who is the only trained transplant infectious diseases consultant in India. Today's subject is differential and approach to fever. I welcome to our guest speaker, Dr. Parikshit Prayag sir, on behalf of GPA. Sir, we all are waiting to listen your speech.
Sure.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kulkarni sir, for the kind introduction. And not the first time that I have been called Dr. Shirish Prayag. That's my father, actually. A lot of you might actually know him. So once again, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I think let me start sharing my screen. Yeah. So, in the next 45 minutes or so, what we'll try and do is we'll discuss the approach to fever, and I'll also incorporate a little bit about fever of unknown origin in my topic. But since we are primarily people, the audience is primarily people who practice in an OPD setting, I'm going to focus more on how to go about it when a patient with fever comes to our OPD at this point of time. Of course, right now COVID is playing a big role in the approach to this, but we'll also look at things beyond COVID. And we'll probably keep about 15 or 20 minutes for the question and answer session, and we'll try and discuss some very practically relevant points. So, if we had to start off by asking us what is the commonest cause of fever of unclear etiology. So, what we mean by fever of unclear etiology is that the patient has been in the healthcare setting for about a week, has had extensive workup, and still no cause of fever has been found. That is fever of unclear etiology, and we'll come to the definitions of it. So usually by the time the patient comes to my OPD, I get a lot of patients of fever of unclear etiology because they have been to a couple of healthcare practitioners, maybe to a physician, before they come to an ID specialist, and they have been worked up to a considerable extent, and that really constitutes fever of unclear etiology. When we first see the patient in the OPD, that's not really fever of unclear etiology. That's fever before we have started workup. So usually fever of unclear etiology most of the times turns out to be an uncommon presentation of a common disease. So let's say if someone has fever and has no other focal symptoms, and over 1 week he has had a chest X-ray done, urine routine done, urine cultures, blood cultures, dengue NS1, peripheral smear, malaria antigen testing done, echo has been done, ESR, CRP, now COVID testing has been done, and he has still continued to have fevers, and we are not sure what the cause of this fever is. Usually it turns out to be a common disease. More often than not, in my clinical experience also in terms of data, more often than not, you will see that this will turn out to be a common disease, which is either presenting in an unusual manner or we have failed to look for all its manifestations. So this will turn out to be something like brucella or TB more commonly. Very rarely will it turn out to be, an uncommon disease like toxoplasmosis or some kind of zoonotic condition. So usually amongst the infections, it will turn out to be a common infection that we haven't looked for uncommon manifestations. So for example, adrenal TB or pericardial TB or autoimmune thyroiditis, these are not things that we look for commonly in our practice, but usually these turn out to be the answers for this mystery. Rarely it will be a rare disease which will manifest either typically or atypically. So rarely will you find a rare disease like, let's say Kikuchi syndrome or some kind of a rare autoimmune disorder. That will be rare. Usually it will turn out to be a common disease. So which means that how do we define fever of unclear etiology? As I said, fever of unclear etiology, simply put, is fever for which we have worked up the patient for about a week and we don't know the answer to that question. So again, remember, fever that you first encounter in the clinic should not be called as FUO. So then how do you define fever? That is the most important thing. And really, a lot of people, even a lot of patients have asked me, that my temperature is about 98.9 in the evening. So is it fever? So first and foremost, when you're trying to see if the patient truly has fever, the textbook definition of fever is 100.4. And the textbook definition of FUO is actually fever which has a temperature of at least 38.3 on several occasions, and the diagnosis is uncertain after 1 week of study in the hospital. But simply put, for practical purposes, the patient should at least have a temperature of 100.4. So does that mean that someone who has a temperature of 99.6 or 99.8 is completely normal? No, that is something like a pre-fever or a pre-hyperthermia range. So usually from 99 to 100.4 is the pre-fever zone. Most of the times in the evening, the normal body temperature is on the higher side. So in the evening, if someone has a temperature of 99, I usually ask them to keep a fever diary before really knowing or before really concluding that this patient has fever. Because for all this discussion that we are going to have over the next 45 minutes or so we must counsel them and find out whether this truly is fever or it's just some fatigue or lethargy that the patient has and it's being called as fever. So in general, a febrile illness will be due to infection, malignancy, autoimmune or immune mediated conditions, some other causes that commonly we fail to look for either in an OPD practice or in an inpatient setting. For example, if someone has been put on antibiotics, the antibiotics themselves can cause what is known as drug fever. So commonly you will have beta-active antibiotics like penicillins, cephalosporins, carbapenems and aztreonam, as well as sulfur drugs like trimethoprim, sulfamethoxazole. So Cetran or TMP SMX. These are common causes of drug fever in clinical practice. Then thromboembolism, often in an admitted patient, we fail to recognize these other causes of fever. For example, this is an important differential of fever in the ICU. Thyroiditis, again, autoimmune thyroiditis is a part of our FUO workup. We usually do only thyroid function tests. Now, thyroid function tests can be perfectly normal in thyroiditis. So what we really need to do is we need to do the thyroid peroxidase antibody or the antibodies for Graves' disease and autoimmune thyroiditis. Factors of fever. I've had patients who have had malingering as the cause of fever for secondary gain. So a teenager who doesn't want to attend college or someone who is in a bad relationship at home or cases of domestic abuse can actually present as factitious fever. I've seen that in the US, I've seen that in India as well. And then central cause of fever. So neurogenic causes of fever can cause very high grade fevers because whatever affects the hypothalamus actually affects our febrile mechanism of the body. And then adrenal causes, as I mentioned. See, these are some of the things which are not very easy to diagnose in the OPD practice. And then you can have very rare febrile syndromes. For example, I have diagnosed a few patients with acute porphyria. Usually porphyria presents as acute abdominal pain with psychiatric manifestations with fever. Familial Mediterranean fever, not very common in India, but I have seen plenty of patients in the US. Usually this familial Mediterranean fever is a condition in which the patient has repeated attacks of fever with serotritis. So if every few months patient will present with fever and pleural effusion or fever with peritoneal findings or let's say fever with some kind of pericarditis. So fever with a serositis, and generally they will have a positive family history for this. So usually it is more common in the Ashkenazi Jewish population. So since US has a lot of Jewish population, we had a lot of, I wouldn't say a lot, but we had a few patients of familial Mediterranean fever. And the drug of choice for that is colchicine. And then you have certain periodic fever syndromes. So these are actually genetic or molecular syndromes in which the patient gets fever after every few weeks or few months. Patient has maybe 1 or 2 weeks of fever. So there are many periodic febrile syndromes. Again, I won't go into the molecular diagnosis of that. So this is in a nutshell what fever is due to. So you will see that not every fever is actually due to infection. It can also be because of autoimmune conditions, malignancies, drug-related fever, thromboembolism, thyroiditis, factitious fever, adrenal causes, and then the last point in India is probably rare porphyria or FMF or periodic fever syndromes. But we should at least remember the first 4 causes of a general febrile illness. So in general, what have the studies shown as far as FUO is concerned? And we'll come to the etiology. So this is one large study. This is, I think, a European study. So this is a large study of more than 300 or almost 300 immunocompetent patients. And when they were worked up for about 3 weeks, and finally they had a diagnosis established, what were the causes of fever? So the teaching point from this is that once the patient comes to you in the OPD, he can end up having any of these. So that's why we have to be on the lookout, and we have to be our clinical acumen has to help us narrow down, because of course you cannot send tests for each and all of these causes from the OPD. So only about 30%, interestingly, in the study turned out to have infectious fevers, and 35% had inflammatory diseases, 15% had neoplasm. So this is FUO, remember, this is fever lasting for more than 1 week. And then there were certain miscellaneous causes. I will not spend a lot of time on the epidemiology of FUO. Let me come to Priscilla's study. So Priscilla is a good friend of mine and a colleague who actually heads the transplant infectious diseases section at CMC Vellore. So what they did was that they followed 300 classic FUO patients in India over a period of 5 years in Vellore, and looked into what contributed to their fever. So this is Indian data, and I think this is relevant. So half of them actually turned out to have infections, 50%, 20% neoplasms, and 20% inflammatory disorders or autoimmune conditions. So again, we have to remember that infections, malignancies, and autoimmune conditions, these are the commonest causes of prolonged fevers. By prolonged fevers, I mean fever which is lasting for more than a week, provided the workup has been done. And this was Priscilla's study again. Not surprisingly, 60% of the infectious fevers were from tuberculosis. But again, at that point of time, we need to ask ourselves, where is the TB coming from? I usually do not like to start patients on AKT just for fever, because when we say TB, we have to ask ourselves, where is the TB? Is it adrenal TB? Is it pulmonary TB? Is it TB of the lymph nodes? Is it TB of the bones? Is it TB of the pericardium? So because the approaches to treating all of these, the durations are different. A lot of times what happens in India is that after 1 week, if we do not have a good cause or good reason for the fever, we tend to put our patients on AKT. Now, some of these patients, or almost 30-40% of these patients, will respond to AKT. But if we don't know where this TB was, in which organ, or how this TB was, one, we will not know about resistance, one will not know about whether or not to add steroids, again, we will not know about the duration of therapy, etc. So again, we need to have all this information at baseline. Interestingly, melioidosis was the second highest differential for FUO in their series, and I'll come to what melioidosis is. Infective endocarditis, abscesses, fungal infections, leishmania, brucella, all these were common causes of FUO. Remember, FUO is fever lasting for more than a week after workup, and that's why you will not see dengue, malaria, or tropical infection on this list, because typically these were infections which are diagnosed in the first week of illness itself. Usually, by the time the fever goes into the second week and it has been not diagnosed, usually it is not tropical. And then neoplasms and inflammatory causes, and this is what they have to do to get the diagnosis. Again, this is epidemiology of, and I have put the 5 Indian studies as far as FUOs are concerned, and you will see that infections are more important causes of fever in India compared to the Western world. So you will see almost anywhere between 40 to 70% of our FUOs are infectious, where if you see the global data, only 20 to 30% of the fevers are infectious. So this was a brief introduction to FUO. But before we call this as FUO, let us start now right from the OPD. So right from where you practice as a general practitioner, if a patient comes to your OPD with fever, what do? So if you are sitting in the OPD and the patient, and many times I am sure you must have faced the situation that the patient comes and tells you that I have had fever since the last 3 to 4 days. No other signs and symptoms. I have had only fever for the last 3 or 4 days. Now, how many of us give this patient antibiotics? How many of us give this patient steroids? And how many of us work this patient down? So, first recommendation would be that we should not put these patients blindly on antibiotics, because, as I mentioned, the fever can have 100 different reasons. So we have to, if the patient is stable, we have to always make sure that we are trying to work out the fever. So how do I start working out this fever? The most important thing as far as fever workup is concerned is history and physical examination. Now, what does history and physical examination tell me? Physical examination tells me if the fever has a particular focus, which means that the first question that I need to answer is, can this fever be pinned down or localized to a particular system? Which means that on symptoms as well as signs, can this fever be of pulmonary origin? Can this fever be of CNS origin? Can this be of gastrointestinal origin? Can this be of genitourinary origin? Can this be a musculoskeletal fever? These are the kind of questions that I need to ask. So, for example, I must perform meningeal signs and a complete neurological examination. I have to auscultate this patient and see if lungs are the cause of this or the focus of the fever. I have to auscultate and see if he has any signs of pericarditis, anything wrong with the gastrointestinal tract, if the patient has any dysuria, any symptoms compatible with the UTI. Again, does he have any symptoms of pyelonephritis? So these are the kind of things. Does he have bone joint pains, muscle aches? Does he have myositis? So if I do a complete physical examination, trust me, about 50 to 60% of the cases of fever that come to your OPD, you can at least narrow it down to a system. Of course, if I narrow it down to, let's say, a UTI, it doesn't tell me, what the bacteria is, or it doesn't tell me whether it's a resistant bacteria or whether it's a fungus. But at least I can then focus on the urinary system. So the main starting point in the OPD is to make sure that we are able to focus or narrow it down to a particular organ system. Now you will see that about 20 to 30% of the patients with fever who come to your OPD, you will not be able to narrow it down to an organ system, because you will find patients in whom everything is fine on the physical examination and yet they have fever. So that is where our next step comes into play. Before that, what do you look for in history as far as fever is concerned? So as far as infectious history is concerned, or fever, if a history of a febrile patient is concerned, you have to always ask them the duration of fever, the pattern of fever, whether there have been 2 bumps of fever. So there will be certain conditions like let's say dengue or certain malignancies, non-Hodgkin's and Hodgkin's lymphomas, brucella, in which you will have fever which stays for about 3-4 days, then the patient gets a break for 3 days, then he again has fever for about 3 to 4 days. So the pattern of fever and the associated symptoms, very important. Traveling history, of course, in this 1 year, hardly anyone has any traveling history, but in the pre-COVID times, traveling history was important. That the fever started after I went to, let's say, Aurangabad. So my suspicion for rickettsia would be more. The fever started when I was in Konkan, when I was enjoying on the paddy fields in Konkan, and then when I came back after 15 days, the fever started. So I'm already looking at things like melioidosis. The fever started after I visited my paternal grandfather in Mumbai, who was being treated at Hinduja by a chest physician. So again, my suspicion for pulmonary TB in this patient is going to be high. So traveling history, exposure history is extremely important. Pets at home, whether this patient has cats at home, dogs at home. So things like toxoplasma, things like brucella, important. Dietary habits. So usually things like infections like brucellosis come from consuming unpasteurized milk. So again, dietary habits are important. But again, recreational habits are important. I remember we had one patient in the US who had fever for about a month, and he had an enormous $1 million workup done, all sorts of PET scans, CT scans, and nothing was revealed. And then when he came to us and we asked him what his recreational activity is, he used to go hunting and he used to hunt deer. This was in Arizona, so he used to hunt deer. And after hunting deer, he actually had an infection known as Francisella tularensis, so tularemia. So again, it's a very odd case. Of course, you will not be finding this very often, but the point is that you have to ask the patient all sorts of things. You have to know his complete family history, complete social history, dietary habits, whether this patient has unpasteurized milk at home. Now, in patients in India, if you ask them to, whether you bring pasteurized milk, they'll tell you, okay, you do this maybe. Then you have to ask them the next question that, at least you put milk in your tea, then they say, of course, I drink tea. So with Indian patients, you have to be extremely patient. You have to ask them each and every question in detail and not get frustrated. This is what I've learned. So again, you have to make sure that we know the complete dietary habits of patients and what they have been doing socially, who has been sick at home, who has traveled at home, etc., etc. So after you do this thorough physical and examination and take a good history, there are certain basic tests that you need to order as far as the workup of fever is concerned. So first and foremost, when you are a general practitioner sitting in your OPD, at least for every febrile workup, I would say that you have to order a CBC. Now the CBC itself gives me a lot of information. When I look at the CBC, I don't just look at it as whether it's normal or abnormal. I look at the differential count. So whether there is fever associated with increased lymphocytes. So that like dengue, clue to an infection like Epstein-Barr virus. Sometimes it can be a clue to malignant or lymphoid malignancies as well. So for example, lymphomas, you will see the lymphocyte lines being abnormal. Is it a fever with an increased neutrophilic pattern? So which means that bacterial infections are high on the differential, which means that if a patient has a WBC count of 12,000 with 95% neutrophils, I'm thinking more about bacterial infections. Is it a patient with increased eosinophils on the CBC? So if it is an increased, if they have increased eosinophils on the CBC, then I am looking at parasitic infections, allergic manifestations, adrenal causes. Remember that adrenal causes of fever can give deranged eosinophils on the CBC, or sometimes malignancies. So malignancies, adrenal causes, parasitic causes, and allergic causes. These will be the 4 broad categories of eosinophilia. Sometimes tropical infections like typhoid can produce eosinopenia, which means that there will be a low eosinophil count or almost an eosinophil percentage of 0 to 1% on your CBC. So again, the CBC gives me a lot of information. It's not whether just their counts are normal. Again, anemia of chronic disease or anemia on the CBC in an otherwise young, healthy male, of course, who is not menstruating, so a male and who has a low hemoglobin, makes me wonder whether this is anemia of chronic disease. So I'm then thinking about autoimmune conditions or TB, something that can give me anemia of chronic disease. And then platelets, very importantly, tropical illnesses, almost all of them or many of them will give rise to low platelet counts. So that's why a complete CBC is very important. Then renal function tests, liver function tests, thyroid tests are usually something that I get on all my patients. at the first encounter. So again, LFTs will tell me whether this is likely to be a tropical infection. So usually thrombocytopenia, leukopenia, transaminitis, these are the kind of things that will tell me that there is a tropical infection which is likely. Now, ESR and CRP, what I want to talk about is that, ESR and CRP are non-specific inflammatory markers. Because of COVID, increased CRP has been associated with a lot of panic thinking that, this patient has a COVID-19 infection. That's not true. All infections, all inflammatory conditions will give rise to CRP. In fact, CRP is slightly more specific for bacterial infections than viral infections, but absolutely, as we have seen from the COVID pandemic, it will be high in almost all infections. Not in all patients, but it is very likely to be high in almost all infections. So again, a very high CRP shouldn't really make us think that this patient has COVID. It just tells me that, this patient is likely to have an infectious or an inflammatory fever. Procalcitonin. Usually procalcitonin at the first encounter, if it's negative, doesn't help me. If it's positive, it helps me because it tells me that it's likely to be a bacterial infection, especially very high procalcitonins. So the cutoff is usually 0.5. Usually procalcitonins of 0.5 to 2 can be inflammatory or fungal. Usually about 2, procalcitonin will be more specific for a bacterial infection. So then procalcitonin is not a very sensitive test. So if it's negative, it doesn't mean much. If it's high positive, it tells me that this is a bacterial infection. Then chest X-ray, blood cultures, doing a urine routine. Remember, we don't need to send urine cultures for all patients whom we are seeing with fever, because unless the urine routine shows us something, we are not really suspecting urinary tract infection as the etiology. Because a lot of times what happens is urine routine and urine culture is same, and the urine culture comes back as, let's say, 10⁴ E. coli, and then these get treated even if the urine routine shows no pus cells. So what does that tell me? That tells me that this patient is colonized with E. coli and really does not have a urinary tract infection. So we must have the clinical acumen to distinguish between a urinary tract infection and urinary tract colonization by bacteria. USG abdomen is again usually something that I do get in my first week of evaluation of a febrile workup. It tells me a lot of useful things. It tells me whether there is a cystitis. It helps me look at the pancreas, gallbladder, and it also helps me see if there is a hepatosplenomegaly, because there I'm going to be looking at disorders that can cause fever and hepatosplenomegaly. 2D echo as well. So when this patient comes to you in the office, does this patient always need an antibiotic? So we've seen that, from all these causes of fever, it's only about 50 to 60% of the patients who will turn out to have an infection. So the simple mantra is that if the patient is stable, he really does not need an antibiotic. But if you have narrowed it down to a particular infection, so for example, if a patient comes to me in my OPD, and if I think that this patient has a UTI, so he comes to me with dysuria, and he comes to me with burning while urinating, and comes to me with a fever, then I know that this is a urinary tract infection. Then you can send the cultures and put him on an antibiotic, something like ciprofloxacin or so on. But unless you have a good reason to put this patient on an antibiotic, you should not be putting this patient on an antibiotic. So just fever is not a good enough reason for me to put this patient on an antibiotic. So why is there high levels of antimicrobial resistance in India and in many of the second world countries actually, and in emerging economies? The reason is that in emerging economies, there is less regulation and now there is more affordability as far as antibiotics are concerned. If you see the real third world economies, if you see Africa, there is not much of polypharmacy because of the affordability. India, China, Brazil, South Africa, these are unique countries in which you can have a lot of people who can afford antibiotics, and yet there can be no regulation. So India is a unique country in which you will have a ward full with dengue and malaria patients, and the adjacent ward will be a ward full of patients who have had transplants and robotic surgeries. So this sort of first world meets third world phenomenon occurs only in India. So that's why we have a lot of antimicrobial resistance in India. So polypharmacy, we put our patients on an enormous number of medicines when they come to our OPDs. Too much of empiric therapy, so treatment before workup. So before we get to all this workup, we put them on antibiotics. Unindicated antibiotics, stewardship infrastructure is poor. Culture-guided de-escalation is not practiced. So if this is a urinary tract infection, and if I've put this patient on a higher antibiotic, I must make sure that after the culture is back, I de-escalate if the patient is stable. Regulation is poor, both from the governmental side as well as from the non-governmental side. there is a lot of over-the-counter stuff which is available in India, and a large number of irrational drug combinations which are used across the country. So coming back to our patient, so once this patient comes to me, I've taken his history and physical, I've sent his CBC, I've sent his RFTs, LFTs, thyroid test, done an ultrasound, and done a very good physical examination. So by this time, once I have these basic tests, and once I've done a good, thorough, basic physical exam and taken a good history, which means that I have spent at least 10 to 15 minutes with this patient, usually I am able to differentiate as far as the focus is concerned. So usually I'm able to tell if this is a pneumonia or a meningoencephalitis or a hepatobiliary infection or a skin and soft tissue infection or a UTI. So usually I'm at least able to narrow down the organ system. If I'm not able to narrow down the organ system, I look at the column on the right side, which means that either I have an infection which is not limited to a particular organ system, or this is a non-infectious fever, which means that I have something like salmonella, which means for which you may not always have a good clue on the history and physical examination. It can be COVID, which can present just with fevers. It can be a bacteria, again, present just with fevers. Malaria, dengue, which can present just with fevers. They can be viral syndromes. It can be brucella, leptospira, rickettsia, chikungunya, TB, melioidosis, and so on. Or, very importantly, it may not be an infectious fever. So this is the first thing that I need to do in my OPD. That differentiate this as a focus or a focused infection versus a generalized infection / a non-infectious etiology of fever. So let's discuss some of these quickly, and which will help you in your OPD practice as a general practitioner. So what is leptospirosis? Leptospirosis is usually a zoonotic condition. Usually, however gross it sounds, we get leptospira when the animal's urine actually comes in contact with our body, which means that if we are in contact with a rat's urine or a wild animal's urine, then we are likely to have leptospirosis. Now, how do we get in contact with these with the urines of these animals? This is because rainwater or just simply walking in the fields or walking on the streets, we might be exposed to these kind of things. So how does it present? Usually a present with patient with leptospira either will present just with fever, that is known as mild leptospirosis, or will present with something known as the Weil's disease. So Weil's disease is when the patient has acute hepatopathy, which means that he has very high bilirubin levels. So jaundice plus high grade fevers with conjunctival effusions, calf pains, increased bilirubin, increased creatinine. This is the classic patient of leptospirosis. So when a patient from a rural area comes to me, saying that he has fever, and if I find that he has jaundice, he has increased creatinine, he has low platelets, and he has bilirubin which is out of proportion to his SGOT, SGPT, I am very highly suspecting leptospira. So remember, the test for leptospira usually does not come out to be positive in the first 5 days, because we are doing an IgM for leptospira. So usually the test for leptospira will not be positive in the first 5 days. Even after that, its sensitivity is not that great. I remember one patient that I had with Dr. Samir Jog, that both of us were managing in Dinara, and we were so sure that this is leptospira that we actually sent leptospira IgM on him 5 times, and the 5th leptospira IgM finally came out to be strongly positive. So leptospira is usually a clinical diagnosis. You will only get time to confirm it, after 5 to 6 days. But the initial 5 days, it will have to be a clinical diagnosis. So that's leptospira. Dengue, I'm sure a lot of you know the basics of dengue. So the first 5 days, we usually send the NS1 antigen. After the 5th day is the time to send the IgM serology. Usually IgG positive in dengue doesn't help me much, because a past infection can be IgG positive. So if I have a patient who I am working up for fever and I find that a dengue IgG is positive, then it doesn't really tell me much. Then if I'm really looking for dengue, I need to do a dengue PCR based test. And again, viral isolation is difficult. Brucella, in the last year itself, I have had at least 10 patients with brucellosis. So a patient with brucella usually will present with about 4 to 5 days of fever. It's not a very acute febrile illness, so at least a week of fever with night sweats, bone pains, hepatosplenomegaly, leukopenia, anemia, thrombocytopenia, or pancytopenia. So usually the bone marrow, usually the reticuloendothelial system is involved. So the bone marrow, spleen, and liver, and some kind of a bone pain is involved in brucella. it's common in some parts of the world. It's really common in the Middle East. In the Middle East, actually they say that in Saudi Arabia or in Dubai or in the United Arab Emirates, if a patient walks into your OPD limping and he has a fever, then he has brucella. That's how classic or that's how common brucella is in the Middle East. So in the Arab world, if a patient comes to you with hip pain or comes to you limping and if he has a fever, then you say that this is brucella. But that might be an exaggeration, but that's just one way of remembering that brucella usually presents as musculoskeletal and reticular endothelial problems. So hepatosplenomegaly, pancytopenias, fevers, and some kind of musculoskeletal problems. Again, how do you diagnose brucella? Not easy to diagnose in the first couple of weeks. Usually you need a PCR in the blood. After the first 7 to 14 days, you can get a brucella IgM. Now, brucella is one funny condition in which the IgM actually can persist for life and the IgG antibody usually becomes negative after therapy. So if you have a patient in whom, let's say, IgG is positive, then you have to take it with a pinch of salt. Then a good way of doing it is sending brucella PCRs. Again, brucella is something that you will not know from the initial exam. But one important clue, you have to always ask your patient if he drinks unpasteurized milk or if he has raw animal products. That's where you get brucella from. When I was in Houston, we had a lot of patients who actually used to consume unpasteurized milk from the Mexican border and get brucellosis and come to Houston. So then rickettsial infections. Rickettsial infections, again, I'm sure many of you must have seen rickettsial infections. But these are the three main rickettsial infections that we have in India. One is epidemic typhus, one is murine typhus, and the third one is the Indian tick typhus. But all of them usually present with hepatosplenomegaly, rash, fevers, and thrombocytopenias with transaminitis. Usually that is the presentation. So again, if you see the presentation of brucella and rickettsia can be very similar. And that is why we do a Weil-Felix test, because Weil-Felix test, actually from the Weil-Felix test, you can know what type of rickettsia it is. So for example, if the OX19 amplifies, I know that this is more likely to be an epidemic typhus. If the OX2 amplifies, then this is more likely to be the Indian tick typhus. So again, for most of these infections or most of the rickettsial infections, the drug of choice is doxycycline. I spoke about melioidosis a little bit. Just before coming to this talk, actually, I saw a patient who has been referred to Dinanath from Konkan and who had COVID in Ratnagiri, and we got about 10 days of steroids, and now he has come to us with disseminated melioidosis. So melioidosis is caused by Burkholderia pseudomallei, and it will usually be in patients who have had a lot of exposure to fields. So for example, if they have spent a lot of time on rice fields or paddy fields, they've been exposed to that sort of an environment, they are at risk for melioidosis. And melioidosis is an infection that can reactivate, which means that it can stay in the body and after many years it can reactivate. We once had a patient who had acquired melioidosis when he was a child in Thailand, and after 50 years he migrated to the US, got an organ transplant done, and then post-transplant actually he had melioidosis. So that is how melioidosis can present. So how does melioidosis present clinically? Clinically, melioidosis presents as fever, pneumonia, skin infection, and deep-seated abscesses. So if I have someone who is coming from Konkan with fever, with chronic fever, who has, let's say, a liver abscess and has a pneumonia or has a skin ulcer, then melioidosis is very high on my differentials. So again, these are the kind of things that we need to look out for when we are evaluating a febrile patient. And this is melioidosis data from the Health Ministry's website from the Government of India for last year. So now coming back to our patient, so he has come to your clinic, you have done a CBC, ESR, you have looked at his eosinophils, lymphocytes, neutrophils, LFTs, you've got an abdominal ultrasound done, there's no hepatosplenomegaly, you've taken a thorough history, you've done a good physical exam, and you can't narrow it down to one particular organ system, right? What is the next step? So then that means that, we have to look, as I said, we have to look for infections that do not limit themselves to one particular organ system. So then you have started with right, you've done a COVID test, you have sent blood cultures for salmonella, and you have clinically ruled out rickettsia, leptospira, brucella because you don't think that it fits into it. That is the time maybe you start thinking about tropical PCR. So that is usually the time day 3, day 4 when I start thinking about tropical PCR. If all this is negative and if I don't think that this patient has a tropical infection either, then this is about day 4 or day 5 of his fever now. Then what do I look at? Then what do? I repeat his blood cultures. I look deeper for things that will not be very evident on the first couple of encounters. So for example, I look for endocarditis. Maybe I do a 2D echo. Maybe I listen more carefully to his heart. Look for other sites of TB. As I told you, TB can manifest in very obscure ways, especially in India. So you can have adrenal TB, you can have pericardial TB, you can have TB of the lymph nodes, you can have TB of the bones. So these are the sites of TB and the clinical manifestations that you need to look at very carefully. Then I look for rarer tropical or zoonotic infections if it clinically fits. So for example, brucella, melioidosis, etc. Then this is the time I start thinking of imaging modalities. So now we are almost at the end of first week or maybe 8-9 days of fever, and the patient still continues to have fever. So what am I looking for in these imaging modalities? I'm looking for things like again hepatosplenomegaly, lymphadenopathies. I also start looking for clues for autoimmune phenomenon. If it is like day 10, day 12, day 14, I start looking for clues for autoimmune phenomenon and malignancy. So that is the time to think of PET scans and bone marrow biopsies. So this is how you grade these patients, or this is how you keep taking them to the next level of investigations. But remember, our endeavor to look for an underlying cause for the fever should never stop. We should never empirically treat them and be happy with it. We have to ask ourselves that why did this patient have fever? If a patient gets discharged unexplained as far as the cause of fever is concerned, it is clinically a little disappointing for me personally, at least. Now, utility of imaging modalities, again, I won't go into the depths of it because I want to leave at least 10 minutes for the question and answer sessions. But usually a PET scan is a great way of looking for an occult infection or malignancy or some kind of a focus. But again, that's not the first test that we should be doing. A PET scan usually is done after you've done a fair workup for this patient. Culture negative endocarditis again can happen in India, and maybe we'll take it up during the question and answer session. Because in India, brucella or coxiella, which is Q fever, these can definitely cause culture negative endocarditis. I've had at least 3 patients with coxiella endocarditis. Now, how useful is a bone marrow biopsy in someone who has unexplained fever? Again, usually it is useful, but only if you have something abnormal in the cell line. So if you can look from this study, if the patients really had something abnormal in their cell lines, only then the bone marrow biopsy is useful. So if you see your leukocyte count, the p-value is low, or if you see the LDH, the p-value is low, or if you see the beta-2 microglobulin, the p-value is low, which means that if I have some kind of a clue on the CBC or the physical exam, then a bone marrow biopsy is useful. I usually do not do bone marrow biopsies for FUs before doing a PET scan. I usually do a PET scan before I do a bone marrow biopsy. And then you can have certain odd diseases, like I said, adult onset Still's disease. So patient who has profound leukocytosis, we do see at least 8 to 10 cases every year, at least in DNH with this kind of picture. So again, leukocytosis, sore throat, lymphadenopathy, splenomegaly, rash, young patient, very likely to have adult onset Still's disease, or what is also known as juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. Then again, drug fever, subacute thyroiditis, as I mentioned, factitious fevers, and cyclic febrile syndromes. These are very likely to have or present as fevers with unclear etiologies. I will skip some of these rare syndromes, and I'll end by again posting the algorithm for an FUO workup. So whenever a patient comes to you with fever, most important thing is a good history and physical examination. Get a CBC, get a differential, think hard about the eosinophils, neutrophils, lymphocytes, get inflammatory markers, urine routine. If it's positive, get a urine culture, not otherwise. Liver function tests and renal function tests, and in some patients, HIV. And then try and narrow it down to a particular organ system. So is this fever, of neural origin, or if this is of pulmonary origin, or if this is of gastrointestinal origin? If you can't narrow it down, then think of certain syndromes or infections that can, to begin with, cause non-specific fevers. Like for example, as I mentioned, dengue or malaria, it will not be restricted to a particular organ system, or salmonella or typhoid. Then keep looking for clinical clues for tropical infections. So we talked about leptospira, brucella, rickettsia, etc. After all this has been done, keep working up while you are seeing this patient. Keep working up. After all this is done, maybe day 7, day 8 is the time I start looking for things like TB, brucella. So if that is clinically not fitting, that is the time I start considering autoimmune causes, start considering a PET scan. If not, maybe a bone marrow biopsy. If nothing else works, then maybe start contemplating anti-TB therapy. But as I said, usually I don't even put patients on anti-tubercular therapy unless I have a CT or a PET scan, because I really am interested in knowing where the TB is, not just if this patient has TB. So this is in general the workup for a fever. So usually remember that FU is usually a rare manifestation of a common condition. Cycling of antimicrobials is almost never the answer. So if the patient has about 10 to 14 days of fever, changing from Cipro to, let's say, piperacillin tazobactam to meropenem to amikacin to colistin usually will not get you anywhere unless the patient is really sick. Then it's justified. So if the patient is hypotensive, is in the ICU, is hospitalized, then it's fine. But in an OPD workup of fever, cycling the antimicrobials is almost never the answer. If we are just changing antibiotics, it tells us that we have failed to find the reason behind the fever. Know the local epidemiology well. So a patient who is presenting from Konkan, or who is presenting from Aurangabad, or who is presenting from the southern part of the country has very different epidemiologies and differentials for fever. Thorough history is the key. Social, travel, exposure history, and we talked about examples, is really the key. PET exposures and so on. Determine if it is differentiated versus undifferentiated fever. So remember, differentiated fever is where it involves a particular organ system. Know when to do a PET scan, when to do a bone marrow biopsy, when to refer to a higher center, etc. And have an algorithm in mind. So each one of you can make their own algorithms and involve people from other specialties. So physicians, IB, rheumatology, microbiology, etc. Because not all fevers are infectious fevers. So again, don't feel shy to involve people from other specialties. The later that you involve these people, the more complex actually is the case when the patients go to these consultants. So again, thank you so much for your patient listening, and thank you, Dr. Agarwal. And I think I'll be glad to take a few questions now.
Here are some questions. Can I ask her?
Yes, of course.
How common is infectious mononucleosis in India?
So infectious mononucleosis is extremely common world over, but usually it will be in the younger population. So in the younger population, if someone has a sore throat, he has a hepatosplenomegaly, then it is very likely to be infectious mononucleosis. So that's when you also consider EBV. Usually in adults or usually in patients who are, let's say, above 35 or 40 years old, it's not very common. But infectious mononucleosis, I always consider as a differential in a patient who has sore throat, hepatosplenomegaly, and let's say who is on the younger side.
Okay. Another question from Mahajan sir. WBC count on day 2nd of fever is 6,000 and on the day 4th is 8,000. Does it indicate bacterial infection?
Usually no, because still it's in the normal range. So if you repeat WBC counts, then they will have some daily variation. So the daily variation can be as much as 10 to 20%. But again, as I mentioned, when I look at a person with fever, just the WBC count is not enough for me. I have to look at whether this has neutrophils. Now, if this patient has a WBC count of 8,000 with 90% neutrophils and with immature cells or band cells, then a bacterial infection is possible. But if this patient has a WBC count of 8,000 with, let's say, 70% neutrophils, then it is very unlikely to be a bacterial infection. So, band forms or the immature neutrophils and the percentage of neutrophils is very important when I am trying to analyze the WBC count.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions for audience?
I think we have some on the chat box here. I'll with your permission, I'll take them up. So Dr. Bharti has asked us, can we start anti-cox treatment on ADA positive? I think that's a very good question, especially in your general practice. If someone has ADA positivity, can you start this patient on anti-cox? Now, my answer to that would be, if it is blood ADA positive, then definitely try and see, where are you thinking of this TB? So blood ADA is not a validated test. I see it being done all the time in India, but it is not a validated test. And the other thing is that we have to know that ADA has very little specificity. So which means that if the ADA is low, I can rule out TB. But if the ADA is high, it may not always mean TB. For example, a lot of autoimmune conditions, malignancies, other infections can give a positive ADA test. So just based on positive ADA, I will not recommend starting anti-TB therapy. But if the ADA is really high, yeah, I want to investigate further. So I want to get imaging, I want to get a sample, I want to send an AFB culture, do a gene expert. If the ADA is low, it helps me in ruling out TB. So definitely the sensitivity of ADA is very high, but the specificity is very poor as far as TB is concerned.
Okay, sir. One more question from Dr. Shilpa Joshi. What is the ideal time period to test for chikungunya patient in GP OPD? Most of the time, even if classic presentation, it comes negative in some cases.
Right. So initially, I would say a good test to do, which is not very expensive in India, is the chikungunya PCR. That can be done at the time of the first encounter itself. So, what we have in-house in Dinanath is something known as a topical panel. So in the first week, we usually have a dengue, chikungunya, leptospira, rickettsia, PCR. Because a chikungunya IgM, most of the times by the end of the first week or sometimes even by the end of second week is not positive. So I completely agree. I have had many patients who have come to me with classic chikungunya-like symptoms, diffuse myalgias, have had exposures or have gone camping and then come back with mosquito bites and have had high-grade fevers, and dengue has been repeatedly negative. So this type of patient is very likely to have chikungunya. But I completely agree, the IgM is not a good way of diagnosing chikungunya for the first 7 to 10 days. So that should be the time when we should get a PCR.
Okay, thank you. One question from Madan Rathi. Treatment for brucellosis.
Brucella, if it is not having any complications, so complication of Brucella is endocarditis or neurobrucellosis or Brucella osteomyelitis. So if it is not involving the bone, brain or the heart, and if it is only Brucella, which means that if it is an acute brucellosis, then the treatment is doxycycline plus rifampicin or doxycycline plus Bactrim, TMP-SNX. But usually most patients need 2 drugs, and usually the treatment it can be anywhere up to 6 to 12 weeks. So, most patients need at least 1 to 2 months of treatment for Brucella. And if the patient has complications, so for example, he has neurobrucellosis. We had a patient last month whose CSF grew Brucella, and we had to actually treat him for about, or last year I would say, we had to treat him actually for 8 months with 3 drugs till the CSF normalizes. So usually treatment for Brucella is doxy plus something. It's not monotherapy, and duration is long, and duration depends on whether it will involve the brain, heart, and the bones.
Okay. Thanks. Now, can I hand over mic to Secretary?
Yes.
Hello, Rupa.
Yes, sir.
This is
Sir,
my-
before we end, I have one question related to current COVID situation, especially in Pune. Like, as we are talking about this second wave, and in like few of the other countries, the COVID infections have really taken a worse form, or we are seeing the mutated form of COVID infections. But at the same time, we are also seeing that the rate of infection, your infections are coming down. So, since being infectious disease specialist, what will you comment about it?
So yeah, I think the incidence has definitely come down. Everything has come down. So for example, in the peak of the pandemic, on all our patients, when we were testing for COVID, the positivity rate was almost 60 to 70%. That has come down to about 10 to 15% now. For every 100 tests that we do in DMH, only about 10 to 20% of the tests are positive. So definitely the incidence has come down. Beds are available more easily. When we were at our peak, we had our COVID ward was filled with 450 COVID patients at any given point of time. Right now, I just came out of COVID rounds and we have about 120, 130 beds occupied. So again, everything has definitely come down. I feel the virulence is also reduced to a little extent. I feel we are seeing less sicker patients than we were seeing, let's say, in September or October. Maybe they were coming to the hospital late at that point of time because beds were not available easily. So definitely it has come down. Now we have seen from the Western world, both Europe, US, that there can be multiple waves of COVID. So we have to be definitely watchful for that. My hope is that, we will not be hit too hard by the second or the third waves. One is that a lot of people in India must have had subclinical infection, and we are closer to a vaccine definitely than we were 3 or 4 months back. So hopefully we will not have a very bad second or third wave.
Sir, one more thing, since you have spoken already, started the talk already towards vaccine, about vaccine, like you being working in COVID ward actually. So similar is the concern for many of the general practitioners or many of the medical personnel. Whether we really need to take COVID vaccination, whether the immunity we receive from vaccine, is it better than what we receive the immunity by true infection, and how safe, how is it possible that many other infections have not yet have come up with a vaccine? There are no vaccine for many other infections like HIV, and for COVID in like 6 months duration there is a vaccine available. So for this, what is your opinion?
So I'll try to answer you. Why do we have a COVID vaccine and why do we not have a vaccine for some of the other infections? So the development of vaccine really depends on whether you have a neutralizing antibody. So if you have a neutralizing antibody for an infection, which means that you have a target to neutralize as far as antigens are concerned, only then vaccine development is possible, which is there in the case of most respiratory viruses. So that's why a COVID vaccine is possible, but an HIV vaccine is not possible. Now, why did we develop COVID vaccine and why did we not develop, let's say, an RSV vaccine or a rhinovirus vaccine? Because simply, it's a game of numbers. If you develop an RSV vaccine, who's going to buy it in the world? Whereas if you develop COVID vaccine, there will be millions of takers for the COVID vaccine. So definitely the research is focused on what the world needs. So that is one of the huge reasons that a lot of money was actually put into developing a COVID vaccine. So the antigenicity and the need actually dictates, which vaccines we can come up with. Is the COVID vaccine safe? I think the COVID vaccine looks like it is safe. There have been rare cases of encephalitis reported with some of the vaccines. But in general, the COVID vaccine looks like it is safe. A few side effects will be a part of any vaccine. So if you see influenza or if you see MMR, also you will have cases of encephalitis after the vaccine. Is it effective? It looks like for the first 3 to 4 months or 6 months, it is effective. Now, in the next 6 months, we will know the dosing schedule. Right now, the dosing schedule is 1 dose, and after 21 days, another dose of the COVID vaccine for patients more than 16 years of age. In the pediatric population, safety is established. So right now, that is the schedule. Is the vaccine better than getting a natural infection? In terms of immunity, probably no. But of course, we don't want to get immunity by getting the natural infection. It's a much safer way of getting immunity as COVID is concerned. So I would definitely say that whenever the government rolls out the COVID vaccine program, as healthcare workers who are on the front because the government will roll it out only once we have established safety. And in the United States, they have already started vaccinating healthcare workers. Many of my friends who actually work in the healthcare settings in the last 1 week have actually received the COVID vaccine in the US. So as healthcare workers, once the government rolls out an official program, we should be taking it. No reason not to. I will definitely take it. Right now, I'm taking it because I've just had COVID 2 months or 3 months back. So hopefully I'm immune. But whenever the program starts, I'm definitely planning to take it.
One more question.
Yes, sir.
From Jayasri Sonis, what should be the approach when temperature of patient when fever is 99 to 100 degree only, but 5 to 6 days? Patient complains only mild body ache and weakness.
Right. So it comes to me a very good question, and very, very often we face this situation. Patient has come to OPD, 5 days of fever, maximum temperature 100, a little bit of weakness, little bit of body ache. First thing to do right now in this situation, COVID PCR. If the COVID PCR is negative, then I would be looking at other things. So this first thing that I would do is a COVID PCR. The next thing I would do is do a CBC, LFTs, and a dengue test. So this patient has had fever for about 6 days. So I'm comfortable doing IgM. Beyond 5 days, I'm comfortable doing IgM. So I'll send dengue NS1, I'll send dengue IgM, I'll do CBC and LFTs and RFTs in the first setting. Let's say a couple of days back, the patient comes to me saying that, I still have fever now, it's day 8. Dengue is negative. and CBC is completely normal, COVID is also negative, that is the time when I'll get an ultrasound, look for hepatosplenomegaly, look for other tropical infections, and then take it from there. So this is how it keeps rolling. And of course, at the first encounter, get a very thorough history and physical. Sometimes you'll be surprised, sometimes patients, the spectrum can be very wide. But you can have a patient who comes to you with 5 to 6 days of fever and body ache, and you send a CPC, and suddenly you see that the platelets are, 25,000, WBCs are 1,500, and hemoglobin is 6. So this patient actually can have acute leukemia. So the differential is wide. So that's why, having a good algorithm in place is really what helps. But I think on the first encounter right now, COVID PCR, CBC, LFTs, and plus or minus dengue.
Okay. Thanks, sir. One more question from Bharati. These days, maximum patients are having low TLC. In this case, we can't prescribe antibiotics. After how many days we should repeat CBC and give further treatment should be given?
Right. So low WBC can very often be because of a viral infection. So many viral infections actually suppress the WBCs as far as the marrow is concerned. So usually these patients will not need antibiotics, and usually from a viral infection, usually about 4 to 5 days, the patients will start recovering their WBC count. Now, as far as dengue is concerned, the thrombocytopenia in dengue recovers beyond 7 to 10 days. So most patients reach their lowest level from day 7 to day 10. So that is another common situation we have. The patient starts getting frustrated because every day his platelets are falling, and you keep telling them the same thing. It can happen in dengue. So when will it actually start to reverse? But on day 7 and before day 10. If you have a dengue patient with persistent thrombocytopenia beyond day 10, you need to look for other things. So, for example, HLH or other infections and so on. So usually by about 5 to 7 days, WBCs from a viral infection will recover, and by about 7 to 10 days, platelets from dengue will recover.
Okay, thanks. Any questions, audience?
I think Jayashree has asked one more question. Does isolated neutrophilia
without leukocytosis carries any significance?
Yeah.
It can, because if I have isolated neutrophilia and the total WBCs are normal, let's say total WBCs are 8,000, but it is 95% neutrophil. So I have isolated relative neutrophilia or neutrophilic leukocytosis with normal WBC counts, right? In that situation, there are two things. One is that, I want to look at the band forms or immature neutrophils. If those are high, then I am looking at a bacterial infection, or likely. If those are normal, then if neutrophils are 95%, what is going to happen is that your lymphocytes are going to be 3 to 4%, which means that if the neutrophils are qualitatively normal, instead of calling this as an isolated neutrophilia without leukocytosis, I'm going to be calling it as relative lymphopenia. Instead of calling it as neutrophils are high, I'm also looking at it as, the lymphocytes are low, and that can happen in a viral infection. So, especially right now, COVID or dengue. Sometimes dengue can also have lymphocytosis, but COVID, influenza, these infections can give you lymphopenia. So anything that is abnormal can give you some kind of a clue.
Okay, thanks a lot, sir. Dr. Parikshit Prayag, sir, thanks a lot for your nice lecture. Now I request, I hand over mic to Secretary Sriram Joshi.
Just before vote of thanks, I would like to inform all the audience for this lecture that we have already started with a WhatsApp group of case discussion related to various infectious diseases, rather various cases, and where Dr. Parikshit Prayag sir has honored to be the consultant for that group. And we as GPA office bearers are very happy, and we are thankful to Dr. Parikshit Prayag for the same. And today's audience also, if someone has not yet joined the group, please use the link and join that group. That group will specifically have questions and case related discussion. So I'm sure it will be helpful for most of us. Those who do not have received the link, please give a call to GPA secretary for that particular link. I hand over charge to Joint Secretary Dr. Sunil Bhujbal sir for vote of thanks.
Thanks, ma'am.
Can I just say something very quickly? Yeah. So the group that we are planning to create, definitely feel free to ask any questions on that. Even simple things, you might have a patient with dengue. How long will the fever last? Those sort of things that can be discussed, and the kind of discussions that will benefit all of us. So that was the aim, to have that group. It's like having my mind is maybe planning our patient setting to
Hello.
yes.
Yes. I Dr. Sunil Bhujbal, Joint Secretary GPA, thanks to today's speaker Parikshit Prayag sir for today's wonderful, knowledgeable lecture. I thanks to today's convener, short form BK, that is Dr. Balkrishna Kulkarni. I thanks to Scientific Committee Chairman Dr. Praveen Dharak and Dr. Prakash Mahajan sir. Thanks to technical partner White Coat and Mr. Ganesh Sham. And thanks to all doctors who had joined for this lecture, Zoom lecture. Thanks a lot.
सेक्रेटरीचा नंबर इकडे लिहितोय ते नंबर
हां.
जोशी सर
मी टाईप करतो.
एक मिनिट 98
आपण चॅट बॉक्स मध्ये सेक्रेटरीचा नंबर देतोय. कुणाला जर जॉईन करायचं ग्रुप मध्ये जॉईन होण्यासाठी आवश्यकता असेल ती लिंक त्या ग्रुप फोन नंबरवर मिळू शकेल आपल्याला. This number is of Dr. Sriram Joshi, Secretary, sir.
Thank you once again.
So thanks to all. Thanks. Thank you, Prakash sir. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, BVK. Hello.
Sorry for mistake.
Huh?
Sorry for mistake.
Yes, madam. End करू.
Oh,
Yes,
yes,
yes.
yes. Thank you, Ghanshyam ji.
Thank you, madam.